This morning, our passage comes from the prophet Jeremiah, from chapter 8, starting at verse 18, and reading till chapter 9, verse 1. And if it's okay, I would love to read this passage from the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Tanakh, because this is the original verses. Listen to God's word. Were I to suppress my grief, my heart is sick within me. Hark the voice from a distant land, the cry of the daughter of my people. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is not her king therein? Why have they provoked me with their graven images, with their strange vanities? The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. For the wound of the daughter of my people I am wounded with grief. I mourn, and dismay has taken hold of me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of the daughter of my people not been restored? Oh, that my head were full of waters, and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. God's words for God's people. Thanks be to God. Pete, Mary Helen, and the choir. It was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Well, when I walked through a little while ago and saw Pete and some folks here, Pete said to me, he says, well, don't you look so lovely, well put together and coordinated? And I said, well, thank you, Pete. I must be doing something right. But then I said, as a true chaplain, my persona may give off being in control, but life has taught me I am not in control. I just cover it up well. So this morning, it's a beautiful morning. We're moving close to the fall season, and life is something else, isn't it? It is truly about searching for answers. Life has been rolling out in ways that just overflow us, and it's tough. Life is difficult. So I have to remind myself every day, sometimes several times a day, that I'm not in control, and that's where my faith begins. Richard Rohr, a very noted Franciscan monk, stated that faith is not for overcoming obstacles, it is for experiencing them all the way through. I've had to learn this valuable lesson because I think, and you may share this with me, and if not, I'm glad for you, because I think I grew up thinking that God was a magic wand God. But God is real in a real world. It just doesn't play out that way. So as we walk in our journey of faith, we cannot encounter God and the condition of humanity without asking a few questions. We cannot be in a trusting relationship with God or anyone and expect to not ask questions about things that we are unsure of or don't understand. Asking questions is what we human beings do when we can't wrap our brain, our head around something, or even our hearts around the going-ons of life. So we spend time in the midst of a life's challenge or a life's interruption searching for answers. And the truth of it is that usually we search for answers to the questions that are not that easily forthcoming. Pretty much, we spend most of our mental capabilities and intestinal fortitude exhausting numerous pathways, ending up with no results in our search. Concrete thinking is most useful in processing concrete situations, but then let life turn around and hit you in the face or pull the rug out from under your feet, and you'll see that life isn't that concrete anymore. That's why life was most fascinating to us when we were children growing up. No major responsibilities or accountabilities. Life through the eyes of a child was simplistic and magical. We grown-ups tend to lose something most valuable when we become an adult, and that loss by name would be the purest form of faith. Somehow God created our brains to function concretely as children, and when we leave childhood, our brains shift into the ability to think abstractly, and then life becomes complicated and perplexing. Hard decisions and hard choices become our reality. Then with warp speed, we are thrust into the realities of being accountable and responsible for our choices and decisions. So we must search and ask questions to travel this road of life. Most of us want to sail our own ship, but we find that there are other captains vying for our position and leadership role. Sounds like a parallel to what happened in the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? I mean, Adam and Eve had this purest form of faith, childlike in nature. and lived in a euphoric paradise, no major questions to ask or to ponder about. God, the parent role, took care of them. Then that sly, slippery serpent says to Eve, "Ah, beautiful lady, taste of this fruit, and you will become like God, knowing good and evil." Sound familiar? Dr. Sigmund Freud said, "I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection." He's right, you know, even as it relates with both our temporal world and God's world. He also stated that most people do not really want freedom because freedom involves responsibilities, and most people are frightened of responsibilities. So maybe that's why we find it so difficult navigating life in its most difficult and painful moments, because we are called to be responsible to that which we question. And many times what we question is the God that we worship, the God that we believe in. Eugene Ionesco once said, "It is not the answer that enlightens, but the question." Bernard Baruch stated that millions saw the apple fall, but Newton was the one who asked why. And Mary Astor stated that once you start asking questions, innocence is gone. Well, that's a good segue back to our text, where our prophet Jeremiah is asking a whole lot of questions, 6 to be exact, about the impending doom that is about to be placed on his people. These questions are good, solid questions that we humans tend to ask God when things don't add up and life becomes unexplainable. It is true that somehow innocence is lost when we begin to ask about our circumstances and how life plays out at certain times. God in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil, sets the stage for the questions that every human being ends up asking. Why, God, does evil exist? Why do we have to suffer? I cannot tell you in 30-some years of ministry in the hospital setting that I have heard this question. It's natural for us to ask. I have not yet heard a really good answer, and I've been through these journeys myself, and I've asked God, why? And I have not yet, on my own, come up with a sufficient answer. Because when you suffer, it challenges you. It just takes your world and turns it upside down. And we sometimes have those biblical words to offer comfort, but in actuality, suffering still exists. So where do we find God in the suffering? Where do we find ourselves in that journey of faith? Whether we encounter tragic suffering or redemptive suffering, as people of faith, we turn to God to search for answers. And that, my brothers and sisters, are the moments when a crisis of faith can occur and our spirit calls out, "Oh God, where are you?" It's the first question the prophet Jeremiah asked when he is at his most lowest point. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is not her king therein? In his own transparent way, our prophet is overcome with grief. He is too close to the situation. for his heart is aching. He goes as far to say that his heart is sick. He begins to grieve and becomes bereaved, and for a moment his grief turns to anger against the people he loves. Have you been there? I have. He questions their actions and their motives and realizes he can't rescue them. We want so much to rescue them. I remember when my mom was in her last stages of end-stage Parkinson, and I never thought that I could be without my mother. But your love just transforms when you see people suffer. And God, I reached out to God, where are you? Why is this happening? Why does she have to suffer? She suffered all of her life. And what comes back to me is something pure and clear. He says, Bonnie Lee, while you were trying to keep her alive, I was preparing her for death. That has stayed with me. That came from nowhere else but God. And it taught me something, that life is fragile. Every day I see how life is fragile in patients and family and even our staff. So God is present. But because we're humans and we want the magical one God, we can't see the real God in our journey. Jeremiah questions their action and motives and realizes he can't rescue them. The only thing he can do is turn to God and ask, why then has the health of the daughter of my people not been restored? Now it is questions like this that really have a unique way of challenging us and our faith. Sometimes we have to reclaim our early beginnings of our faith journey. Sometimes we have to look back and reflect where God has been in the midst when we didn't think so. Because usually, I don't know about you, it takes getting through something and looking back and say, oh, that was you, God. That was you. And I can't tell you how many times when people are in their worst tragic situations that they feel ashamed to ask God questions. I hear it all the time. But you shouldn't question God, should you? Well, turn to the Bible. There are many questions there. Our prophet asked 6 of them. And I want to share this without sounding chastising, but why can't we question God? If we're getting to know this God every second of our life, why can we not question? But the important thing when we question is to listen. I mean, there are numerous scriptures in the Bible where people in their times of crisis, times of grief, speak out and ask God a question. In actuality, how are we going to learn anything if we don't ask the questions? Jeremiah is at a place in his life and prophetic calling that he is confronted with the ultimate challenge. He is challenged by his compassion and his faith in God. He calls out, "For the hurt of my daughter, of my people, I am hurt. I am dark. Astonishment has overtaken me." We could even say he is in the dark night of his soul. That's a term that comes from the Roman Catholic spirituality that describes a spiritual crisis in the journey towards union with God. Towards the union with God. Like that described by St. John of the Cross. While the spiritual crisis is usually temporary, it may endure for a long time. In our passage, you can hear Jeremiah's heartache You can feel his deep anguish of his soul. Sometimes we can fall into a spiritual depression. It's a type of spiritual despairing when we somehow lose our soul's compass because we can't understand what or why suffering has come into our lives. The question why is very human to our life's journey, and as people of faith, we turn to God and ask for meaning. So as for our prophet Jeremiah, he begins to ask, why? With all these questions, Jeremiah is searching for answers. He is searching for his way through the darkness, or rather the dark night of his soul. His grief becomes inexpressible heartache because this is the people of God. They are about to be destroyed in war. And they have turned away from God. He feels responsible for his people, and the only thing he can say is, "Oh, that my head was a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people." Because sometimes that's all we can do. He is just not overcome with grief over the fate of his people. He is spiritually despairing and confronting his God and his faith. The love that he had once expressed for his people momentarily turns into something vile and shaming. He blames them for the way things have turned out. He is searching for something more spiritually deeper than just reconnecting with God. He is wanting to make sense out of the horror that is about to happen. Eckhart Tolle, known as one of the most spiritually influential persons in the world, refers to this dark night of the soul as he states, "Yes, I have also experienced it. It is a term used to describe what one could call a collapse of the perceived meaning in life, an eruption into your life of a deep sense of meaninglessness. The inner state in some cases is very close to what we conventionally call depression. Nothing makes sense anymore. There's no purpose to anything. Sometimes it's triggered by some external event, some disaster perhaps, or an external level. The death of someone close to you could trigger it." Or even the way you build up your life and give it meaning, and that meaning that you have given your life, your activities, your achievements, where you are going, what is considered important, and the meaning that you have given your life for some reason collapses. Jeremiah, like we all do, in his despair, turns to his covenantal faith and the ancient of words of a God that promised his people that he would deliver them. Jeremiah's God was the same God whose divine agency was, is, and will be rooted in faithfulness to his people. And so the prophet must deliver a message of hope in a seems to be hopeless time, and our prophet is struggling to find his voice and message of hope. Even in today's world where we live in the post-9/11 society, people struggle to find hope. Unlike any point in history, that event has put us on shaky ground. We live in such a hostile world where the respect of life and people has and continues to wither like the grass on a hot summer's day, parched and desolate, filled with thirst for just a drop of water. We live in a world betwixt and between hope and despair, standing on shaky ground of faith and love and not knowing how to navigate this God who exists between knowing and being unknowable. And all I know is that this God is mystery. And the more I try to trust the mystery, I seem to become closer to a real faith in a real God. I don't know about you, but I grew up in church hearing surrender. Surrender to God. And I have not really been good at that. But you know something? That's where they say, as they say, the rubber meets the road, is when we surrender, wanting to rescue, wanting to fight, wanting to be in control, wanting to have answers. We just surrender that passion and need for that and redirect that passion to a God that's faithful. We don't live in a magic world. And for some reason, when you read the scriptures in the Bible, none of the folks are perfect people. And I think we hold on to that word perfect so much that it gets in our way. You know, loss can certainly transfigure your heart and soul. We seek comfort and solace and strength in one another, hungry for something different. That's the message. Even Jeremiah, he can't rescue his people. They've turned away from God. They made that choice. The only thing he can do is grieve over the loss. And a lot of times, that's where God is. Sometimes there is no reason, no exception for nice people. God leaves room for us to be human. And it's up to us to surrender and trust the mystery of God. Jeremiah was both a prophet of judgment and hope. His was a tragic message for his people who refused to worship the one true God. Rather, they surrendered to idolatry and the pagan religions. They had reached the limits of their strength and courage, unwilling to reach beyond the temporal things and grasp onto the spiritual things outside of themselves. They were resistant to reaching higher to something they could not see with their own eyes. They were lost in their self and unrelentingly to relinquish control. They were simply vulnerable and afraid, unwilling to be transparent and express their feelings in order for a higher form of healing love to touch their wounds. You see, my brothers and sisters, these wounds are filled with tragedies of life. For some, it's just the fact of being born and being unloved. For others, it is the loss of relationships, of being connected to life, hope, and a courage to live. The prophet brings to us this morning his words of hope in a different way. It is a hope that we rely on because God is faithful to us. He has been since the dawn of time and before. It's sometimes just in a simple touch or a smile or a greeting, a welcoming touch, a welcoming smile. Because there's so many people that are still looked down upon, we turn our heads away from. The world is in a crisis, but it has been ever since the fall of humankind. So all we can do is trust the mystery, surrender our control, and let God do what God always does. offer us grace and mercy. Thanks be to God. I'd like to end with this prayer. It was written by Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk from long ago. And I use this when I work with patients at our hospital, going through emotional and mental disabilities, because their world is different. So here is a prayer of trust. May it be etched upon our hearts. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I actually am doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always. Though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone.